Marjorie Barlow, I want to tell you first how happy we all are that you are here and how honored we are to have you at the International Teachers Congress. At what point in your life did you actually start to train teachers?
To actually train them? 1950.
Uh-huh.
Up to that time, Alexander had been the only person training teachers. And I had two pupils who I knew were destined to become Alexander teachers. They were both professors at the Royal College of Music, which was just behind where I work. And they couldn't possibly have got up to Victoria, but they could always spare a couple, 3 hours just to pop up the steps and come to me. And at that time, I heard that Alexander wasn't actually going into the class all that much, and that Walter Carrington was really doing a great deal of the work. And as I had been FM's assistant when Walter was in the training course, it didn't make much sense, really. So we talked it over and decided we would start our own. That's how it started.
And how many teachers, not exactly number, but would you say you and Dr. Barlow have trained?
Well, I don't know the exact number. I've never counted, but it was between 1950 and 1980, or 81, really. And I never had more than 7 in the class. And it was pretty continuous throughout those 30 years.
And what have you found to be the most difficult thing for a person training to be a teacher to learn about the work?
The whole idea of a training course to me is teaching people to really know how to work on themselves, to get those experiences which can't come from wonderful teachers' hands, of actually making your own new experiences with what happens when you work on yourself. Otherwise, they haven't got anything to teach their pupils about how to work on themselves. So a lot of the time is spent working on yourself, just as it was with FM's class.
You said yesterday that FM did not have great hands, that he had a great brain, and that he had... Did I miss that? Did I get it wrong?
Yes, he had wonderful
I thought you said that was not his greatest thing, that his brain and his powers of observation were.
No. His hands were absolutely fantastic. He could hardly touch you and totally transform it, everything. Oh no. Isn't it terrifying, that people can not hear what you're saying, or hear the opposite of what you're saying? Really, one should never open one's mouth. It's funny,
Politicians learn that.
I've always refused to have anything to do with the media. I won't give interviews. I won't do anything like this. This is a special occasion.
Well, we won't get it wrong this time.
But the first time this year I did it for the Daily Mail because everybody pressured me rather, all the people I trusted. And you should see what came out. None of my pearls of wisdom, just a lot of awful gossip and getting it wrong too.
Well, how important do you think hands are to a teacher?
I think they're very, very important. And I think if the person has really worked very hard on themselves, that delicate craftsmanship, I think is the word, is terribly important, because you can put people awfully wrong by giving them a wrong stimulus. But I don't think it's the main thing in teaching. I think the main thing in teaching is really insisting that the person works themselves. You see, this isn't something really that you get from the outside. I always go back to FM. What happened with him? There he was with a problem. What did he do? What was the method he used to get from A, where his problem was, to the solution? And he used to say, if anybody can do what I do, if they will do what I did. But none of you want anything mental. Nobody wants to use this. So there are many things that are important about the hands. Very important how you put your hands on. But you've got to be watching yourself all the time. This is the important thing. But another thing that's frightfully important is how you take them off. It's almost as important how you take your hands off. You're giving somebody the directions, and then you get an idea you're going to go somewhere else in the body, and the whole nervous system judders like that.
How would you talk about what Alexander called direction?
I would say that every time an idea comes to you to do anything at all, messages are sent from your brain through your nervous system to the rest of you. Remember, I'm not a scientist, I'm only an Alexander teacher, but this is, you know, the way I see it, very, very simply, really. The movement is then carried out. Well, now, before we have lessons, all this is totally automatic. Habits are built up, and they're built up in the nervous system. Never mind about the old muscles and bones, you know, it's the direct connection. You see, there's no division between your brain and the rest of your nervous system. And it's that immediacy that is so wonderful. When you send a message, a conscious message, it's there before, you know. And so that anything that gets in the way or is interposed between the message given, you know, there's a lot of people like to have images and all that sort of thing.
Right.
That is all unnecessary.
So when you say that we interfere with ourselves, you're speaking of that neuro response that takes place between the brain and the rest of the body, and how we interfere with the, should I say, the purity of it, or the cleanliness of it, or the directness of it? Maybe?
Yes, you see, when the stimulus comes, I mean, this really brings us back to inhibition, doesn't it? This is the keystone of the whole Alexander technique. You see, he couldn't get anywhere. He went up every avenue that he could think of, and it wasn't until he realized that every time that stimulus came to speak, back went his head. Mm-hmm. And he tried everything, you see, from putting it forward to, you know, everything he could think of. But one day he saw that it was his response, his automatic, habitual response to the stimulus, that was the trouble. It was so quick. So he realized that his first bit of work was to, when the stimulus came, say no to it. Not say no to the stimulus, and this is very important, but to say no to the first reaction to that idea. What happened at first? It was a habitual thing, you see. But if you say no, there's the stimulus, there's the response. If you don't say no, it's like that. It's habitual. It's perpetual motion, you know, just like an automaton. Mm-hmm. We're a lot of robots, really. But when this stimulus comes, you don't allow that response to happen, there's a little bit of space between the two. A place of freedom there. The only freedom we'll ever have in this world, I think. You know, people talk about freedom in a big way, but if that happens, if you can refuse to respond to the stimulus, you have three choices. Either you can decide to allow your habitual response to happen because it's the most appropriate for the situation you're in, or you can decide to make a conscious new response, or, best of all, you can decide to do nothing, you know, if that's appropriate. But it gives you the chance to respond appropriately to this moment.
Would you say that FM was an extraordinarily patient man to have experimented with himself in this way to come up with this?
I simply can't believe it, you know. It is the most fantastic story. I think that he was a very passionate, very tempestuous man. I mean, in his initial state, very not bad-tempered, but very quick-tempered. And my mother used to say that, you know, if he saw someone ill-treating an animal or something like that, anything like that, he literally saw red, and they were afraid he was going to murder somebody one day. You know, I mean, it was really so quick. And I mean, this is his initial endowment, really. But before I started going to Ashley Place to have lessons, my mother warned me. She said, "You'll be in tears every day." Only once, but it wasn't FM who did it. and this was the fantastic change, you see. And of course, it was very important for him to apply the work to these terrifically quick, deep emotional responses. And in a way, that was why the work appealed to me when I first read Constructive Conscious Control, that it was possible, A, to become more aware, to reach perhaps a level of awareness that was a little bit better than the one I'd got, and also to not to be so subject to these emotional swings, really. You know, I was like a pendulum.
And that's in the family, it seems.
Well, I suppose it must be yes, I suppose it must be in.
Well, you are one of the few teachers that I have ever read things that you have written which talk about the emotions and the spirit relative to the ideas of conscious control.
Yes.
And I wonder if that comes out of your personality, or the fact that Alexander himself was also interested in that, and we don't hear that much about that aspect of his work.
Well, I'm glad you've asked me that, because it's very difficult to define what a religious person is. One thing he was not was dogmatic. If he was asked about religion, see, people love to pin FM down to get his opinion on this, that, or the other. And they would ask him direct questions like, do you believe in, what do you believe, FM? And he used to say, I believe everything and I believe nothing. He would not, what's the word I want, pontificate on subjects that were not his special province. He had his own way, his own beliefs, his own relationship with the universe. It sounds a bit silly, really, but he had a sense, I'm sure, of being the universe being a rather intelligent place. You know, that he had a great sense of purpose, and in his whole life, really, and he had a very, very strict religious upbringing. Church on Sundays 3 times a day. Sunday school in the afternoon, yes, all the children, there were 8 of them, you know. I mean, there was a big age gap between the first and the last. But my mother told me this, of course. And he was a very religious boy and young man. But he had a younger brother who had meningitis, got meningitis, and screamed. And of course they were out in, you know, very far from doctors. Nobody could do anything. And FM prayed and prayed, and the baby died. And this made him think again. This really brought him up short, you know. So that, well, to me, he was the most religious person in the real sense of anybody I've ever met. And he was so inspiring. He really could lift you, you know, if you were in a bad state. He could, just by talking to him somehow, and talking about the work, you know, suddenly you were up there, and, you know, rather like Bach's music, and you saw it all made sense.
And in your own further work on yourself and your own studies, you have made some connections between this work and some of the, what I would call very practical Eastern spiritual philosophies. And I find that unusual, and I'm glad to have access to that, because there are many teachers who do not consider this only something that applies to the body and mind, but that the spirit and emotions can be affected as well.
Well, of course. It's the whole person, isn't it? And I think, rather like FM, I had a very strong religious sense from the beginning. Well, you know, from when one gets it. And went down quite a number of paths. Since I started the work, you see, the wonderful thing is you've got a criterion. Since I started doing the work, I would explore these various avenues, and when I came up against a contradiction with the technique, it was the other thing that went. You see, so that I've got that lovely guide in everything, really. If it conflicts with what I know about the technique, I'm not interested any longer. But there are certain things, I think, which don't conflict at all. And I don't allow these things that I pursue for my own personal development to come into my teaching, except indirectly, of course. One can't help saying what one believes. But I certainly wouldn't approve of any kind of admixture of I do think the battle is to keep the Alexander teaching pure, By that I don't mean that people can't develop their own ideas, but our job is to teach the technique. But when it becomes a bit of Tai Chi and a bit of yoga and a bit of this and a bit of that, you see, there isn't time in a training course for that. There really isn't time.
Do you feel that there's a lot of that going on in the
Well, there is,
Alexander
isn't
work
there?
now?
I know that it's inevitable with any teaching, if you look back through history, that with time it becomes diluted, it becomes changed, it becomes adulterated, if you like. And we all have to bring to it what we are. This is really what we're talking about, isn't it? What a person is. And certain things have influenced me very greatly. For instance, Krishnamurti. I love his teaching, and my husband and I used to go and listen to him whenever we could. And for a time I was very interested in the Gurdjieff work, but not Gurdjieff, the Maurice Nicoll, you know, the Jungian. And I used to go and be taught about that for about 7 years, whenever I could, and really sort of picking out what was, you know, what was on the same line. You see, truth is one, isn't it? However you get to it. And the extraordinary thing about FM was that he had no school. He wasn't, I mean, it was entirely himself. It was absolutely original, what he did.
I'm glad to hear you say that all these other things must be kept within the framework of the work as we know it, so that it is able to grow as what it is. When you were training, or let me put it this way, at this time it's obvious that both men and women have made great contributions to the Alexander work.
Yes.
And it's marvelous that we don't, in this field, have to worry about equal pay and those kinds of concepts. When you were working in your early training or in your early work, did you encounter any difficulties being a woman doing this work?
Not at all. It's never occurred to me when I'm working that there's any such thing as a sex difference. No difference at all.
Well, I recall that you mentioned that AR said, oh, she's going to run off and get married.
Well, yes, he did say to me quite often, you know, we've sweated blood to train you, and all that's going to happen is you're going to go off and get married and give it all up. And of course I did get married, and I didn't.
And you didn't give
it all up? My mother was funny too. She said to me when I got married, of course when you get married you won't want to go on working. I went on working. Then when I got pregnant with my daughter, well, now, when you have a baby, of course you won't be able to go on working. And then when I did, and then my son arrived. And now you've got 2 children, you can't possibly. But you see, it's so easy. You just fit the pupils in to your baby's routine. And of course you have to cut down. But it's a wonderful life for a woman. If you've got a nice husband who'll give you the freedom to do it, who's also in the work, which is a help, you know. But
yes, I would say that you and Dr. Barlow probably are unusual in that sense. How has that been for you, both being in the work together? Well,
we've had to work it out. You see, we're very, very different sorts of people, as is obvious. He's got his own contribution. I mean, he's made a wonderful contribution to the work, and it wouldn't be where it is today if he hadn't written books and so on. One thing I will not allow anybody to do is interfere with my work, and that's been made quite plain. You know, in that field, I do what I think about my teaching.
How do you keep a sense of excitement and freshness? How do you keep from getting fixed about the work?
Because I think I'm terribly lucky, but I find it more exciting the longer I do it. You see, you're always having new experiences with your... I learn from my pupils all the time. I learn... Really, I ought to be paying them, you know. No, truly, I feel this. The whole thing is such an exciting adventure. And if you're working on yourself, you're making new experiences, so that it's never the same, you know, even with the same pupil. And that's very interesting, because FM used to say the ideal is if you can approach your pupil every time you give them a lesson as if you'd never seen them before, so that you see them as they are today. You don't bring to this encounter all you know of how they've been in the past. Give them a chance, he used to say, to be what they are today. And this is a very important idea, because if one could treat one's nearest and dearest in this way, you know, not bring to the, when you see them in the morning, everything that's happened in the past 46 years, you know, it gives everybody freedom. It would be lovely.
Do you feel that the technique, I shan't say that it's an end in itself, but that as an applied work, well, let me say this, Walter suggested that it's wonderful for people to have another activity to do.
Oh, yes.
So that they can use the technique actively in something else.
Absolutely, it is wonderful, and I think it's very important for teachers to keep on learning new things. For instance, I was 42 when I started to learn the classical guitar, and I mean, I don't play it very well, I admit, but I've had an enormous amount of pleasure out of it, and it was so lovely, lovely to be put back in the position of a pupil. You see, you've got to remember all the time what it's like to be a pupil, how difficult it is, and people forget this. So I love to begin to learn something new and use the technique to apply to it. It's very difficult with a, excuse me, a musical instrument.
Yes.
Extremely
Yes.
difficult.
Was it difficult for FM to be patient after he had spent all this time working on himself and developing his ideas and his own use? Was it difficult for him to be patient with beginners?
Well, it had been. Obviously, what my mother told me about, you know, how cross he was going to get with me. But by the time I landed up there, which was 1932, he was never impatient with me, or with anybody I saw him teaching. He realized, you see, I mean, he really knew and remembered how difficult it is. And he used to say to me sometimes, you know, the people who come here are the salt of the earth. But if they knew what they were going to have to undergo, they wouldn't come. You know, when the first. But then he used to say, well, where else can they go?
Indeed. Do you look forward to further developments in this work, either for yourself or through students that you have trained? Where do you see the Alexander technique headed?
I look forward to it developing in many, many different ways. FM used to say, we're only on the fringe of this thing, only on the fringe. We've got so much more to learn, and it will develop in all sorts of directions and be applied to all sorts of different things. But the danger is that the real basis of it will get lost. And he said, he continually used to say to us, stick to principle. If you stick to principle, if you use the basic thing that I used to get from where I was to where I wanted to be, you can't go wrong. And people have so many different talents and gifts and directions in which they want to go. And given that basic fidelity, I think is the word, to that thing, you can't go wrong. It's when they throw away the baby with the bathwater. And this is what worries me about the technique and certain developments, that I did read somewhere that it was old-fashioned to give orders. Don't you love it? You know, that improved on that. But, oh dear. I always go back to FM. What did he do? I say to my students, if you're in doubt, go back to what he did. That's what we've got to do.
How do you think that we can prevent this either watering down or unfaithfulness
We can't.
to the principle?
We can't. We can only look after ourselves. We've only got one field to plough, and that's this one.
I believe, however, that this International Congress and the presence of yourself and Dr. Barlow and the other master teachers will do a great deal to influence younger teachers who have had no exposure to all your work and perhaps give them a desire to really get to the principle?
Approfondir les choses, for which there is no translation into English except get to the bottom of it, which is very ugly. Yes. Yes, well, time will tell, won't it?
What do you feel has been your major contribution to the technique through your training of teachers or your writings or your work generally?
Never thought about it, really. I don't know.
Well, you certainly have made a contribution and are making one still.
Well, I've had such fun doing it, you know. It's not a question that's ever come into my head, really. You know, Bill's the writer, Bill's the one who lectures and is interviewed, because I've always tried to avoid. All I've ever wanted is to be left alone, in peace, not to be interfered with, to work quietly with somebody who's prepared to come and spend half an hour with me in my room. And that's all I've ever asked of life since I started the technique. You see, so it isn't quite like that, is it?
No.
What has been my contribution? I haven't the least idea, or even if there's been one.
Oh, there's no doubt.
But, well, no. The great thing is, you see, that it's enabled me to live my life, I hope, improving in the sense that what I'm interested in is, and what I've always been interested in, is knowing what I'm doing. Thinking. Think about that for a minute. Thinking what you are doing. You know, these phrases come and go. They're in the sort of language, and we never think what they mean. Thinking what you are doing. I like to say thinking how you are doing. That's the other one. But you see, thinking in activity was such an important idea to FM. And you see, he used to call it a means of learning to control human reaction. And his idea was that you could bring the body and the mind and the whole organism, the whole person, into a unity. You see?
And this thinking and activity, is this different from what we normally associate with the word thinking?
Oh, yes. Well, it's a very special quality, isn't it? It's not... You see, words are so difficult, aren't they? Because, as FM used to say, any word I use has got barnacles on it. You know, everybody brings their their past experience of that word. And he used to say to me, I really needed to invent a new language. But if I had, nobody would have understood a word of it. So, there you are. No, it's very hard to put it into words what ordering or giving messages is, but it's a very attentive process. You've got to pay attention, and this is something we all find extremely difficult. You know, our attention span is about 1.5 seconds. And talking about ordering, FM used to say, any fool can think of one thing at a time and go on thinking of it. But when you have to go on thinking one thing and add two, and go on thinking of one and add two and add three, that's about as much as most of us are capable of in a lifetime's learning. But you see, he did give us examples of a long sequence of orders in the monkey, going into monkey and going over the back of a chair with the hands on the chair, because you've got to give, well, you know the whole sequence. I mean, it's.
But just what you were just saying, I think, is why creative people, performing artists, are so tuned into Alexander's work, because you have to be thinking of so many things at once, and this is such a wonderful practice in that.
That's right.
And a discipline in sharpening your awareness at those levels.
That's right. And paying attention to more than one thing at a time. He used to say, if we hadn't got that capacity, none of us would be here. You know, we wouldn't have survived. And he was very keen on being attentive to what was going on around you. And you know, when you're talking to someone, you've got to be attentive to them. You've got to be with them.
But in a sense, did he talk about concentration?
Oh, did he not? It was a forbidden word, verboten, absolutely. he used to explain to us that concentration means bringing everything to a point. What we need is a kind of awareness which is as wide as possible, taking into account as many factors as we're capable of taking into account.
Which is marvelous.
But you see, the thing about why musicians and people like that are so in the same world is because they have to spend hour after hour after hour. When I go to a concert, I look at those instrumentalists and I think, my goodness, how many hours of solitary, disciplined work has gone into the fact that they are sitting here tonight playing that violin or whatever. And that is what the work is. And unless you do that, and especially if you're a teacher and training people, unless you are doing that work every day, like playing your scales, he used to say, every day go back to those words.
I want to thank you for your words and tell you how grateful again and honored we all are to have you here.
Thank you very much.